Good evening. Welcome to our Bible study tonight. I'm so glad to be able to connect with you in this way. And tonight is our last in a series of people in the Old Testament that we are studying. This is Glad Reunion. This is has been our attempt to reacquaint ourselves with our religious ancestors. And tonight we're doing the person of Ezekiel. And this is a really special one to me because when I was in the seminary, I took a class on Ezekiel, and I thought that I had read that book before. I found out I was sadly mistaken. On the surface, it seems so bizarre. It is not like the other prophets that we study, and it really takes some good commentary and insight to be able to understand it better. But Dr. Clopel does a fabulous job with this, and I'm so glad to be able to share it with you tonight. Well, he begins by saying, and this brings out the history teacher in me, that a person without a memory is only half a person. He says the way we choose to deal with the past is a crucial factor in shaping both the present and the future. And Ezekiel does just this. Ezekiel found himself living in what he calls a hinge era. It was his experience to painfully live out what other prophets had predicted was going to happen, what Amos said was going to happen, Hosea and Isaiah, what they had seen coming, which was the total demise of Israel as a nation. In 598 BC, Nebuchadnezzar came through with his army out of the east and captured Jerusalem and took Ezekiel and some 10,000 Hebrew people into exile, many of them very prominent people. So you can imagine how, very successful and people living the good life now found themselves in exile and poor. You can imagine how much depression there was during that time. He says Ezekiel was called to live out his days and exercise a ministry of interpretation. Have you ever heard that before? A ministry of interpretation. Really, really interesting. And he says it's hard to imagine a more difficult set of circumstances in which to try to speak on behalf of God. Not only were these people beaten and humiliated, they were shaken down to their toes religiously because their God had been shattered in their minds. They were experiencing something maybe close to what the Japanese experienced in the 1940s when their emperor, who they thought was divine and who could never be beaten, turned out, guess what, just to be another human being and was certainly capable of defeat. So the Israel people at this time are not only refugees, they were also really delivered into the depths of despair that comes when they feel like their God has seemingly failed and the ground beneath their altar had just collapsed and swallowed up everything. He says the fall of Jerusalem was like the night the world ended for the Israelites. And to this dispirited and disillusioned people came this man Ezekiel, himself in exile. That's the situation he was called to minister to. Had to be incredibly difficult. But in so doing, he helped save the soul of Israel from what could have been total despair and disintegration. There are many times in the Old Testament when we have to see our history through that lens. Literally, that the Jewish race could have been wiped out or that the Jewish religion may not have made it to the next generation. And that's exactly what we see in the person of Ezekiel. It's very, the people just could have been assimilated into the Babylonian culture and we would have had no religious ancestry. He says, so Ezekiel helped clarify the Israelites' image of God in terms of what he was and what role he had played in these events. He says disillusionment is the child of illusion, always that way. The reason we arrive at wrong conclusions is often that we begin from false assumptions. And this is how Ezekiel diagnosed much of Israel's religious problems. He said they had two erroneous ideas about God that had taken root during their time in the Promised Land. One was that God was somehow a local God. Remember, that was a part of the pagan belief. Every city had its own God. So if an army came in and captured a city, that meant their God was bigger and more powerful than that God, as if God would be combined to the boundaries of Palestine, but specifically in the temple. And also from this had come the second idea that God would protect Israel no matter what. No matter what would happen, they thought that there's no way that the worst could occur. Actually, that is exactly what happened. The nation had become just like a spoiled child who assumes his parents have no higher hopes than to cater to his every whim. Such a child does not attempt to understand reality or find out how history works, but presumes that he or she can go on being an infant forever with the parent always picking up the pieces. I hope you hear me talking about that a lot. How important it is for us to have adult theology and not think and to think that we somehow are caught up in fifth grade Sunday school. We have to go beyond that, and that's what it takes to study a book like Ezekiel. You can't study this from an elementary level. This is heavy stuff and really hard to interpret. But he says this is how the chosen people had come to visualize God, which shows how far off they had gotten from their roots. And it's little wonder that they were devastated spiritually. What could it mean except that God was not the God they thought him to be? They had come to false conclusions because they had come into this with false assumptions. He says Ezekiel set a graphically different picture. You have it all wrong, he said. In effect, you have reached erroneous conclusions because you have started from the wrong premise. He says Israel had balked at a cooperative venture with God. She had chosen a destiny other than the one Yahweh had given her, and this is why calamity had befallen her. The fault was not with God. The fault was with Israel herself and her rebellion against her true identity. This is not just about a different people from the past. This is the same with us. We fall because we do not buy into what God has in store for us, our true identity. We go off on our own, and this is what Israel had done. He says for 22 years, Ezekiel hammered away at this particular interpretation of God's image, which was given to him at the outset of his ministry. He says, when you read the first chapter of Ezekiel, it is really easy to get confused from all the bizarre figures that you find there. So he saw a storm cloud approaching filled with lightning and thunder, and in the midst of it was a chariot-like throne, and the wheels within wheels were supporting it, and four-faced creatures looking in all directions. He says, just like Isaiah, Ezekiel realized that God is utterly beyond our capacities of comprehension. But these images also had a practical significance for the particular place in history where Ezekiel found himself, for the whole vision was meant to convey an overwhelming power, not weakness. This wheels within wheels meant God could move in any direction at will. He was mobile and not rooted to one spot. The four-faced creatures stood for all the living creatures under God's control. By facing every direction, the symbol signified that God is simultaneously aware of every corner of the earth. So Ezekiel had this vision. It was his way of saying, here is what our God is really like. Our trouble all along has been that we refuse to let God be himself and have his way. He had not let us down. We let God down. His purposes were not defeated, even though we have failed him. This is Ezekiel trying to give hope to the people. He says, I doubt whether Israel could have survived the trauma of the exile religiously had Ezekiel not clarified who God was in the midst of all this. Here we are again seeing where there are these times in history where they could have been wiped out, but someone like Ezekiel gave them new hope by their new interpretation of what God was from the very beginning. He says what he did was to set out before these exiles a true hope, not a quick and easy hope, but a hope born of mercy and rooted in the fact that the God whom they had forsaken was not going to forsake them. So he ends by describing these three images. The first was the valley of the dry bones. You can imagine what that would have looked like a year after a battle, and all the bodies had never been buried, all these dry bones. He said that must have been how the exiles felt, because the vision of God commanded Ezekiel to speak to those bones, and the prophet watched flesh come back to those bones and breathe life into them once more. If God is one who can create something out of nothing and resurrect things from the dead, then what is impossible? He says, ultimate despair is presumptuous, says Ezekiel. Israel may appear at the moment dead and scattered like dry bones, But Yahweh is the kind of God who knows his way out of the grave. Isn't that beautiful? He says this exile is not final. There are still possibilities with a God who can make dead things come to life again. The second vision that he had was this great river coming from there under the altar in the new temple. And he says one needs only to see just how barren that terrain is to realize what a tremendous promise there is in this image. This image of the river is to the natural order that of what the resurrection of the dry bones was to human beings. It represented the coming of vitality to the places of deadness. Many times water is associated with life. The tenderest hope and image of all, however, was Ezekiel's picture of God himself becoming Israel's shepherd and seeking out those who have strayed away and gotten lost. He says, think of what it was to have been for the Hebrews in exile during Ezekiel's time to hear that they were not forgotten or abandoned, but that God would someday seek them out again and bring them back to himself. He says this is a word every one of us needs to hear in our lostness, in our beaten downness, that we are not abandoned or forgotten, that we still matter to our Maker. This is God seeking out each one of us. What a comforting conclusion that he comes to. He says what Ezekiel did was two things about God. Not only that he was able to work with sinners, but he was willing to do so. And isn't that a comforting word that we need to hear in these days? I'm so glad to have gone through this book with you. I hope it has meant as much to you as it has to me, and I hope it brings you great hope in a pretty tough time. Go in peace.